Isabella found particular friendship with the daughters of Richard's supporters, girls close to her own age who helped her navigate the subtle hierarchies and unspoken rules of English noble society. Her favorite companion was Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret was only 2 years older than Isabella, but seemed worldly and sophisticated to the young queen. It was Margaret who taught Isabella English children's games, who helped her understand which ladies in waiting could be trusted with secrets, and who warned her about the political undercurrents that even children couldn't entirely escape. The two girls would spend hours in Isabella's private garden practicing their needlework, while Margaret explained the genealogies of English noble houses and the ancient feuds that still simmered beneath the surface of court politeness. Isabella was a quick learner, and her French perspective on English politics often provided insights that surprised her older companions. Why, Isabella once asked Margaret, do the English nobles seem to watch each other so carefully? In France, there are factions and quarrels, but here everyone seems to be waiting for something to happen. Margaret, wise beyond her years, explained that Richard's reign had been marked by conflicts with his nobles almost from the beginning. There had been a major rebellion when he was young, and he had never entirely forgiven those who had opposed him. Meanwhile, many of the great lords believed Richard was too fond of his court favorites and too willing to ignore their advice on matters of war and governance. The king is powerful now, Margaret said, but power in England must be shared with the nobles. Your marriage helps him because it brings peace with France, but some think it shows he is weak, that he prefers negotiation to conquest. Isabella absorbed these lessons with the seriousness of a child who was beginning to understand that her life was connected to forces much larger than herself. She began to watch the interactions at court with new eyes, noticing how certain nobles would fall silent when Richard entered a room, how conversations would shift when she appeared, how even her French ladies in waiting seemed to choose their words carefully when discussing political matters. The years 1397 and 1398 passed peacefully for Isabella. She grew from a tiny child into a more confident girl, her English becoming fluent, her understanding of court life more sophisticated. Richard continued to treat her with paternal kindness, and she began to feel genuinely at home in England. The massive stone walls of Westminster became familiar rather than intimidating, and she could navigate the complex maze of corridors and chambers without getting lost. Thus, her education expanded beyond the typical feminine accomplishments of needlework and music. Richard insisted that she learn to read and write in both French and English, and her tutors included some of the finest scholars in the kingdom. She studied history, particularly the chronicles of English and French kings, learning about the great figures whose actions had shaped the world she now inhabited. One of her favorite lessons involved maps. Her tutor, a learned clerk named Master William, would spread great parchments across the floor of her study chamber, showing her the extent of both kingdoms and explaining how geography had influenced centuries of conflict. Isabella would kneel beside these maps, tracing the coastlines with her finger, imagining the ships that carried armies and ambassadors back and forth across the channel. "See here, Your Grace," Master William would say, pointing to the narrow waters between Dover and Calais. "This small strip of water has been both a bridge and a barrier between our peoples. Your marriage represents the hope that it might finally serve only as a bridge." Isabella nodded solemnly, understanding even at 8 years old that she embodied something larger than herself. She was not just a girl learning to be a queen. She was a living symbol of peace between two nations that had been enemies for longer than anyone could remember. But symbols, as Isabella was about to learn, could be fragile things in the violent world of medieval politics. The first signs of trouble came in early 1399, when Isabella noticed changes in the atmosphere at court. Conversations stopped more abruptly when she appeared. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried glances when they thought she wasn't looking. Even Margaret Holland seemed distracted and anxious, though she tried to maintain their usual routines. Richard himself seemed different. His visits to Isabella's apartments became less frequent, and when he did come, he appeared preoccupied, sometimes staring out the windows toward the Thames as if expecting to see ships on the horizon. His usual gifts of books and trinkets ceased, and Isabella began to wonder if she had somehow displeased him. The truth was far more serious than a child's transgression. Richard was facing the greatest crisis of his reign, and it had nothing to do with his young queen. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, whom Richard had exiled the previous year, had returned to England with an army, claiming that he had come only to reclaim his inheritance, but clearly intending much more. The English nobles, many of whom had long chafed under Richard's rule, began to flock to Henry's banner. The carefully constructed stability that had allowed Isabella to feel safe at the English court was crumbling with terrifying speed. Isabella first realized the severity of the situation when she woke one morning to find that several of her English ladies-in-waiting had disappeared during the night. When she asked her French attendants where they had gone, she received only evasive answers. By afternoon, she could hear shouting from the courtyard below her windows, and when she looked out, she saw armed men wearing unfamiliar livery. Margaret Holland burst into Isabella's chambers that evening, her face pale with fear. "You must pack immediately," she whispered urgently. "Only the most essential things. We're leaving Westminster tonight." "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, her heart beginning to race with the kind of panic she hadn't felt since her first days in England. "To the Tower," Margaret replied. "The king says it's for your safety." She didn't finish the sentence, but Isabella understood. The Tower of London was both palace and prison, and in times of political upheaval, the distinction often became meaningless. By 1399, Isabella's carefully constructed world was collapsing with breathtaking speed. The signs had been there for weeks, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Whispers in corridors that fell silent when she approached. Her English ladies-in-waiting exchanging worried glances when they thought she wasn't looking. Even Margaret Holland, her closest companion, seemed distracted and anxious, though she tried to maintain their usual routines of needlework and gossip. But it was Richard himself who revealed the true scope of the crisis unfolding around them. His visits to Isabella's apartments had become infrequent and strained. When he did appear, he seemed like a different man entirely. Gone was the gentle, paternal figure who had showered her with gifts and taken genuine interest in her education. In his place stood someone who stared out windows toward the Thames as if expecting to see enemy ships on the horizon, someone whose hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. The truth when it finally emerged, was more devastating than a 9-year-old girl could have imagined. Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's own cousin, had returned from exile with an army. The man Richard had banished just months earlier was now marching across England, gathering supporters with every mile. What Henry claimed was a simple mission to reclaim his inheritance had become something far more dangerous. This was nothing less than a bid for the English crown itself. For Isabella, the implications were terrifying in their complexity. She wasn't just witnessing the downfall of her husband and protector. She was watching the collapse of the entire political framework that had brought her to England and kept her safe. The peace treaty between England and France, sealed with her marriage, now hung by the thinnest of threads. The careful diplomatic balance that had allowed a French princess to become Queen of England was crumbling, and she found herself trapped at the center of forces she couldn't control or fully comprehend. The first concrete sign that her world had changed came on a gray October morning when Isabella woke to find several of her English attendants had vanished